The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Prime Minister Jonathan Hartwell stepped out of his black sedan. His polished Oxford shoes clicked against the stones with unusual urgency. Today was different from his regular weekly audience with the Queen. Today, he had come with a purpose that went far beyond diplomatic pleasantries. Hartwell had been Prime Minister for barely 8 months, having climbed the political ladder through calculated moves and strategic alliances. At 42, he was one of the youngest people to hold the office, and his ambition burned as bright as his perfectly styled auburn hair. The recent polls showed his approval rating slipping, and he needed something dramatic to restore public confidence in his leadership. The idea had come to him during a late-night strategy session with his advisors. If he could demonstrate his authority over the monarchy's ceremonial guards, it would send a powerful message about who truly held power in modern Britain. The Royal Guard, with their iconic red uniforms and bearskin hats, represented centuries of tradition and unwavering loyalty to the crown. If he could make them follow his commands, even briefly, it would be a symbolic victory that the media would never forget. As Hartwell approached the main entrance, he noticed Captain James Morrison standing at attention near the ornate gates. Morrison was a decorated veteran with 25 years of service, his chest adorned with ribbons that spoke of campaigns in Afghanistan and peacekeeping missions across the globe. His weathered face remained expressionless beneath the shadow of his bearskin hat, but his sharp blue eyes tracked every movement in the courtyard. The Prime Minister had done his research on Morrison. The captain came from a military family that had served the crown for generations. His grandfather had fought in World War II, his father in the Falklands, and Morrison himself had earned the Distinguished Service Order for his actions in Helmand Province. More importantly, Morrison was known for his strict adherence to protocol and his fierce loyalty to the monarchy. Hartwell's plan was simple in concept but complex in execution. He would arrive early for his scheduled meeting with the Queen, then approach the guards under the pretense of inspecting their readiness for an upcoming state visit. Once he had their attention, he would begin issuing direct orders, gradually escalating his demands until it became clear that he expected them to obey him as they would obey the Queen herself. The Prime Minister had spent weeks studying military protocol and the chain of command that governed the Royal Guard. He believed he had found a legal loophole that would force them to comply with his orders. As the head of government, he technically outranked everyone except the monarch herself. In the Queen's absence, he reasoned, that authority should transfer to him. His press secretary, Sarah Chen, waited in a discreet position across the courtyard with a small camera crew that had been told they were filming a documentary about the daily operations of government. The footage would be released strategically, showing the Prime Minister taking charge and demonstrating decisive leadership. It would be the perfect antidote to recent criticisms about his ineffective handling of economic policy. Hartwell straightened his navy blue suit jacket and checked his watch. The Queen was not scheduled to arrive for another 30 minutes, giving him the perfect window to execute his plan. He had specifically timed his arrival to coincide with the changing of the guard ceremony, when additional soldiers would be present to witness his display of authority. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and tourists were already beginning to gather beyond the palace gates, their cameras ready to capture the famous ceremony. Hartwell smiled to himself, knowing that his actions would soon overshadow any routine changing of the guard. This would be a moment that historians would analyze for decades to come. As he walked across the courtyard, Hartwell reviewed the speech he had prepared. He would begin by complimenting the guards on their service, then transition into discussing the importance of recognizing proper authority in the modern constitutional framework. From there, he would issue his first command, something simple like requesting they present arms or adjust their formation. Captain Morrison remained motionless as the Prime Minister approached, his training evident in every aspect of his bearing. Behind him, 4 additional guardsmen stood in perfect formation, their rifles held at precisely the correct angle, their uniforms immaculate despite the early hour. These were not ceremonial soldiers playing dress-up for tourists. They were active military personnel with real combat experience and an unshakable commitment to their duty. The Prime Minister had underestimated the depth of that commitment. He had viewed the Royal Guard through the lens of politics, seeing them as pawns to be moved in his game of public perception. What he failed to understand was that their loyalty to the crown was not a matter of convenience or career advancement. It was a sacred trust that had been passed down through generations, forged in the crucible of battle and tempered by centuries of tradition. Hartwell reached into his jacket pocket and felt the folded piece of paper containing his legal justification for what he was about to do. His constitutional law advisor had spent days researching the relevant statutes and precedents, building what they believed was an ironclad case for the Prime Minister's authority over the royal guard in specific circumstances. The tourists beyond the gates began to point and whisper as they noticed the Prime Minister's early arrival. Some recognized him from television and started taking pictures, unaware that they were about to witness one of the most embarrassing moments in recent political history. Captain Morrison's eyes remained fixed on a point somewhere beyond the Prime Minister's shoulder, following the military tradition of not making direct eye contact with civilians unless specifically addressed. His hands rested on his rifle with the casual confidence of someone who had handled weapons in life-or-death situations. The morning breeze stirred the plume of his bearskin hat, but otherwise, he might have been carved from stone. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the boundaries between political power and military tradition, between modern ambition and ancient duty. Prime Minister Hartwell was about to learn that some institutions cannot be bent to serve political convenience, and that true authority comes not from legal technicalities, but from earned respect and unwavering principle. Prime Minister Hartwell approached Captain Morrison with the confident stride of a man who believed he held all the cards. The morning sun glinted off his gold cufflinks as he clasped his hands behind his back, adopting what he considered an authoritative posture. The tourists beyond the gates had grown quiet, sensing that something unusual was about to unfold. "Captain Morrison," Hartwell began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of countless parliamentary speeches, "I trust you and your men are prepared for the day ahead." Morrison's response was textbook military precision. "Yes, sir. The guard is ready for all scheduled duties." His voice carried no warmth, no indication that he viewed this as anything more than a routine interaction with a government official. Hartwell smiled, interpreting the formal response as a sign of respect for his position. He had expected the guards to be somewhat stiff, but their military bearing actually worked in his favor. It would make his eventual demonstration of authority even more impressive when captured on camera. "Excellent," the Prime Minister continued, beginning to pace slowly in front of the formation. "I've come early today to personally inspect the readiness of Her Majesty's Guard. As you know, we have several important state visits approaching, and I want to ensure everything meets the highest standards." This was partially true. There were indeed diplomatic visits scheduled, but Hartwell's real motivation had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with political theater. His press secretary had positioned herself strategically, ensuring the cameras would capture his most flattering angles, while documenting what he hoped would be his moment of triumph. Captain Morrison remained silent, understanding that no response was required. His training had taught him to be wary of politicians who spoke too much and promised too little. In his experience, the most dangerous situations often began with someone in a suit explaining why they needed to deviate from established procedure. The Prime Minister pulled out his folded paper and made a show of consulting it, as if reviewing important official documents. In reality, it contained talking points his staff had prepared, along with the legal justification he planned to cite when the guards inevitably questioned his authority. "I've been reviewing the constitutional framework that governs the Royal Guard," Hartwell announced, his voice growing more confident. "And I've discovered some interesting provisions about the chain of command during the Queen's absence." Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had served under enough commanding officers to recognize the tone of someone preparing to overstep their bounds. The captain had dealt with ambitious politicians before, usually during overseas deployments where civilian officials sometimes forgot the limits of their authority in military matters. The other guardsmen remained motionless, but there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. These were experienced soldiers who had learned to read dangerous situations through years of training and combat deployment. Something about the Prime Minister's manner set off their professional instincts, like the feeling of being watched by an unseen sniper. Hartwell began his first test, starting with something that seemed reasonable. "I'd like to see your men present arms, Captain." I want to ensure their movements are crisp and coordinated for the upcoming ceremonies. This was a moment of truth. Presenting arms was a standard drill that the guards performed regularly, but the request came from someone outside their normal chain of command. Morrison found himself in the uncomfortable position of choosing between potentially embarrassing a high-ranking government official and maintaining proper military protocol. "Sir," Morrison replied carefully, "the guard presents arms on command from Her Majesty, senior royal family members, or designated military superiors during specific ceremonial functions. I would need clarification on the authority under which you're making this request." The captain's response was perfectly professional, but it contained an unmistakable challenge. He was essentially asking the Prime Minister to prove he had the right to issue such orders. Morrison had chosen his words carefully, providing an educational explanation rather than a flat refusal, giving Hartwell an opportunity to reconsider his approach. But the Prime Minister was too committed to his plan to recognize the warning. He had anticipated this moment and felt confident in his prepared response. The cameras were rolling, tourists were watching, and backing down now would make him look weak and ineffective. "I'm operating under the authority granted to the head of government during the Queen's temporary absence," Hartwell declared, unfolding his paper with a flourish. "According to the Constitutional Reform Act and several relevant precedents, executive authority flows through the Prime Minister when the monarch is not physically present." Morrison's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his blue eyes. He had studied constitutional law as part of his officer training, and he knew exactly how much legal authority the Prime Minister actually possessed over the Royal Guard. More importantly, he understood the difference between theoretical legal frameworks and practical military reality. The tourists had moved closer to the gates, their phones and cameras now openly recording the unusual exchange. Some were live streaming to social media, unknowingly broadcasting the beginning of what would soon become a viral political disaster. "Sir," Morrison said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "the Royal Guard serves at the pleasure of the Crown, not the government. Our oath of allegiance is to Her Majesty personally, not to any political office or temporary authority." The captain's words hung in the morning air like a gauntlet thrown down. He had just politely but firmly informed the Prime Minister that his understanding of military hierarchy was fundamentally flawed. The Royal Guard was not part of the regular army that might fall under government control during certain circumstances. They were a special unit with ancient privileges and responsibilities that transcended normal political structures. Hartwell felt his first flutter of uncertainty, but his pride in the presence of cameras prevented him from backing down. He had come too far and invested too much political capital in this moment to retreat now. His advisors had assured him that the legal precedent was solid, and he chose to trust their research over the captain's objections. "Captain Morrison," the Prime Minister said, his tone becoming more forceful, "I appreciate your dedication to tradition, but we must also recognize the realities of modern governance. I am not asking you to violate your oath to the Crown. I am exercising legitimate executive authority that complements and supports that oath." The semantic game had begun. Hartwell was trying to reframe his demands as something compatible with the Guard's existing duties, hoping to find a middle ground that would allow him to demonstrate authority without forcing a direct confrontation. But Captain Morrison had spent enough time in political briefings to recognize bureaucratic doublespeak when he heard it. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharper shadows across the courtyard as the two men faced each other in a battle of wills that neither could afford to lose. The tension in the courtyard had become palpable, like the charged air before a thunderstorm. Captain Morrison stood his ground, his years of military experience telling him that this situation was about to escalate beyond diplomatic courtesy. The Prime Minister's insistence on pressing forward despite clear explanations about protocol suggested either dangerous ignorance or willful disregard for established authority. Hartwell decided to push harder. Believing that a more direct approach would force the guards to acknowledge his position, he had convinced himself that their resistance was merely procedural hesitation that could be overcome with sufficient determination. "Captain, I'm not making a request," the Prime Minister declared, his voice rising slightly. "I am issuing a direct order under the authority vested in me as head of Her Majesty's government. Have your men present arms immediately." The words echoed across the stone courtyard with unmistakable finality. Hartwell had crossed the line from diplomatic inquiry to direct military command, forcing Morrison into a position where he had to either comply or openly defy a senior government official. Morrison's response was swift and unambiguous. "Sir, with respect, you do not have the authority to issue military orders to the Royal Guard. We do not serve under the government's chain of command, and I cannot comply with your request." The captain's words were delivered with the calm professionalism of someone stating an indisputable fact. He wasn't being disrespectful or insubordinate. He was simply explaining reality to someone who seemed determined to ignore it. But Prime Minister Hartwell interpreted the refusal as a personal challenge to his authority. His face flushed slightly as he realized that his carefully planned demonstration was not going according to script. The cameras were still rolling, tourists were still watching, and he was beginning to look like someone who didn't understand his own government's power structure. "Captain Morrison," Hartwell said, his tone becoming sharper, "I think you're confused about the constitutional relationship between the government and the military. Perhaps you need a refresher on who actually runs this country. This was a mistake." Morrison had spent his entire adult life serving his country, had bled for it in foreign wars, and had earned his position through decades of distinguished service. Being lectured about patriotism and duty by a politician who had never worn a uniform struck at the core of his professional pride. The other guardsmen remained motionless, but their awareness had sharpened. They could sense their captain's growing displeasure, and their own loyalty to Morrison was absolute. These men had served together in combat zones where trust and mutual respect meant the difference between life and death. "Sir," Morrison replied, his voice taking on a steely quality, "I am perfectly clear about my duties and responsibilities. I serve the crown as have generations of my family before me. That service is not subject to political convenience or temporary authority." The captain's words carried weight that went far beyond military protocol. He was speaking about something fundamental to the British constitutional system, something that politicians often forgot in their pursuit of power and publicity. Hartwell felt the situation slipping away from him, but his pride wouldn't allow him to retreat. His press secretary was making urgent gestures from across the courtyard, suggesting that perhaps it was time to end this confrontation gracefully, but the Prime Minister was too invested in proving his point. "Captain, you seem to forget that the government provides your funding, determines your mission parameters, and ultimately decides how the military is deployed," Hartwell said, his voice now carrying an unmistakable threat. "Perhaps you'd like to reconsider your position on following legitimate orders." This was the moment when the confrontation moved from professional disagreement to personal antagonism. Morrison had been threatened before, usually by enemy combatants who lacked the political sophistication to understand what they were dealing with. Having a prime minister attempt to intimidate him with bureaucratic pressure was almost insulting in its crudeness. The tourists beyond the gates had grown silent, sensing that they were witnessing something significant. Several were broadcasting live on social media, their commentary ranging from confusion to embarrassment for the Prime Minister's obvious struggle to command respect from the guards. "Sir," Morrison said, his voice now carrying the authority of someone who had commanded soldiers in battle, "the Royal Guard has served the crown for over 3 centuries. We have faced down enemy armies, protected the monarchy through world wars and civil unrest, and maintained our oath of loyalty through countless changes of government. That tradition will not be compromised today." The captain's words rang with the weight of history and tradition. He was not just speaking for himself, but for every guardsman who had ever stood watch at the palace, every soldier who had died defending the crown, every generation that had passed down the sacred trust of protecting the monarchy. Hartwell realized he was not just fighting one man, but challenging an institution that predated his political party, his government, and his understanding of how power actually worked in Britain. The Royal Guard represented something beyond politics, something that existed independently of electoral cycles and parliamentary majorities. But the Prime Minister had gone too far to back down gracefully. His reputation and future political prospects now depended on somehow salvaging this situation, even if it meant escalating the confrontation to dangerous levels. "Captain Morrison," Hartwell said, his voice now carrying the full authority of his office, "I am ordering you to have your men present arms. If you refuse to comply, I will consider it an act of insubordination that will be reported to your superiors and result in appropriate disciplinary action." The threat hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Morrison knew that the Prime Minister had the political influence to make good on his threat, at least in terms of creating bureaucratic headaches and formal complaints. But he also knew that some principles were worth defending regardless of personal cost. The captain's response would determine not just the outcome of this confrontation, but the future relationship between Britain's political and military establishments. The tourists continued filming, unknowingly documenting a moment that would be studied by constitutional scholars and military historians for years to come. Captain Morrison's response to the Prime Minister's ultimatum came with the measured precision of a man who had faced far more dangerous threats than political intimidation. He took one step forward, closing the distance between himself and Hartwell just enough to make his next words unmistakably clear. "Sir," Morrison said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute certainty, "you have fundamentally misunderstood both the nature of our service and the limits of your authority. I will not comply with your order because it is not legitimate, and I would respectfully suggest that you reconsider this course of action before it becomes embarrassing for all involved." The captain's words were delivered with professional courtesy, but they contained an unmistakable warning. He was offering the Prime Minister one last opportunity to retreat with dignity before the situation became truly humiliating. But Hartwell was beyond the point of rational calculation. His political instincts, usually sharp enough to navigate the treacherous waters of Westminster, had been overwhelmed by his determination to prove his authority. The presence of cameras and tourists had transformed what should have been a private conversation into a public spectacle that he felt compelled to win. "Captain, you are in direct violation of a lawful order from the head of government," Hartwell declared, his voice rising to ensure the tourists could hear every word. "I am placing you under official notice that your refusal to comply will be documented and reported through appropriate channels." Morrison almost smiled at the politician's naivety. The idea that a Prime Minister could place a Royal Guard officer under official notice for refusing an illegitimate order demonstrated such a fundamental misunderstanding of military law that it bordered on comedy. "Sir," the captain replied, his tone remaining professionally neutral despite the absurdity of the situation, "I serve under military law and regulations that are quite specific about legitimate chains of command. You are welcome to file whatever reports you feel are necessary, but they will be reviewed by military authorities who understand the actual legal framework governing the Royal Guard." The other guardsmen had remained perfectly still throughout the exchange, but their attention was now completely focused on the confrontation. They trusted their captain's judgment absolutely, and his calm confidence in the face of political pressure reinforced their own sense of duty and purpose. The tourists had grown bolder in their observation, some moving closer to the gates to capture better footage of what was clearly becoming a significant political embarrassment. Social media posts were already beginning to spread, with hashtags like Trudeau Prime Minister vs Guards and Yo Royal Guard Stand Strong trending across multiple platforms. Hartwell's press secretary had abandoned all pretense of discretion and was now making frantic hand signals, urging the Prime Minister to end the confrontation before it caused irreparable damage to his reputation. But Hartwell was too focused on the immediate battle of wills to consider the broader political implications. "Captain Morrison," the Prime Minister said, his frustration now clearly visible, "I want to make something perfectly clear. The government that I lead determines military budgets, approves promotions, and sets defense policy. Your continued service depends on the goodwill of the political establishment that I represent." This was a direct threat, and everyone present understood it as such. Hartwell was essentially telling Morrison that his career would suffer if he continued to resist political pressure. It was the kind of crude intimidation that might work on civil servants or junior military officers, but it showed a complete misunderstanding of who he was dealing with. Captain Morrison had been threatened by Taliban commanders, IRA operatives, and various other enemies who possessed far more credibility and actual power than a frustrated politician. The idea that a Prime Minister could threaten his military career for upholding proper protocol was almost laughable. "Sir," Morrison replied, his voice now carrying a hint of steel, "my service record speaks for itself. I have served this country with distinction in multiple combat deployments, earned decorations for valor under fire, and maintained a spotless record of professional conduct. I am confident that any review of my actions today will conclude that I upheld my oath and followed proper military protocol. The captain's response was devastating in its quiet confidence. He was essentially telling the Prime Minister that he welcomed any official investigation because he knew exactly where he stood legally and professionally. The morning sun had climbed higher, and the growing crowd of tourists provided an increasingly uncomfortable audience for Hartwell's very public failure to command respect from the guards. What had been intended as a demonstration of executive authority was rapidly becoming a textbook example of political overreach. Hartwell made one final attempt to salvage the situation, raising his voice to address not just Morrison, but all the guardsmen present. I am speaking to all of you as representatives of Her Majesty's government. Your duty is to serve the Crown and the people of Britain, and the government speaks for those people. I am ordering you to present arms and demonstrate proper respect for civilian authority. This broader appeal was an act of desperation, and it backfired spectacularly. The guardsmen didn't even shift their eyes toward the Prime Minister, maintaining their focus straight ahead as their training demanded. Their loyalty to Captain Morrison and their understanding of proper protocol made Hartwell's appeal not just futile, but embarrassing. Morrison stepped forward again, and this time his voice carried the full weight of his authority as a senior military officer. Gentlemen, he said, addressing his men while looking directly at the Prime Minister, maintain your positions and continue your duties as directed. You will take no orders from unauthorized personnel, regardless of their civilian rank or political position. The captain's words were a masterpiece of military precision. He had just publicly instructed his men to ignore anything the Prime Minister might say, while simultaneously establishing beyond doubt that Hartwell was considered unauthorized personnel, despite his high office. The humiliation was complete, but the Prime Minister was too invested in the confrontation to recognize defeat. His next move would determine whether this embarrassing situation would become a full-scale political disaster that could end his career. The moment of Captain Morrison's definitive rejection hung in the air like a death knell for Prime Minister Hartwell's political ambitions. The tourists beyond the gates had grown from a handful of curious onlookers to a substantial crowd, all with their phones raised, capturing every moment of what was rapidly becoming the most spectacular political self-destruction in recent British history. Hartwell's face had progressed from confident authority through frustrated determination to barely contained rage. His carefully styled hair was beginning to show signs of perspiration despite the cool morning air, and his pristine suit seemed somehow less impressive when worn by a man who clearly couldn't command respect from the soldiers standing before him. This is outrageous, the Prime Minister sputtered, his composure finally cracking. I will not be dismissed by a soldier who refuses to acknowledge legitimate government authority. Captain Morrison, you have just ended your military career. The threat was delivered with all the venom Hartwell could muster, but it fell flat against Morrison's unshakable calm. The captain had faced enemy fire without flinching. An angry politician posed no threat that could compare to the dangers he had already survived. Sir, Morrison replied, his voice maintaining its professional tone despite the personal attack. My career will be judged by those qualified to evaluate military service, not by politicians who mistake authority for understanding. The captain's response was perhaps the most devastating thing he could have said. Without raising his voice or showing disrespect, he had just told the Prime Minister that his opinion about military matters was essentially worthless. The crowd of tourists had begun to murmur among themselves, and several were clearly live-streaming the confrontation to global audiences. Comments were already flooding social media platforms, with viewers around the world expressing amazement at the Prime Minister's obvious lack of understanding about his own government's limitations. Hartwell's press secretary had given up trying to signal discreetly and was now openly gesturing for the Prime Minister to end the confrontation immediately. The footage being captured was political poison that would haunt Hartwell for the rest of his career, assuming he still had one after this disaster became public knowledge. But the Prime Minister was beyond rational thought. His ego had been wounded by Morrison's calm defiance, and his political instincts had been overwhelmed by personal pride. He decided to make one final desperate attempt to assert his authority by involving the other guards directly. "Guardsman," Hartwell called out, addressing one of the soldiers standing behind Morrison, "step forward and present arms immediately. That is a direct order from your Prime Minister." The guardsman addressed didn't even blink. His training had been clear about the chain of command, and Captain Morrison remained his immediate superior, regardless of whatever drama was unfolding in front of him. The soldier's complete lack of response to Hartwell's command was perhaps more humiliating than an outright refusal would have. Ben Morrison's expression darkened for the first time during the entire confrontation. The Prime Minister had just attempted to undermine military discipline by bypassing a commanding officer, which was not just inappropriate but potentially dangerous in real operational situations. "Sir," the captain said, his voice now carrying a warning edge, "you will not address my men directly. Any communication with personnel under my command goes through me, as per standard military protocol that exists for very good reasons." Morrison had just delivered what amounted to a public rebuke of the Prime Minister's conduct, and he had done it in full view of tourists, cameras, and social media streams that were broadcasting the confrontation to audiences around the world. The situation had moved beyond embarrassing into the realm of genuinely damaging political theater. Hartwell was no longer just failing to demonstrate authority. He was actively undermining his own credibility with every word he spoke. The sound of approaching footsteps on cobblestone broke through the tension as a new figure entered the courtyard. Sir Edmund Blackwood, the Queen's private secretary, had arrived for an unrelated meeting and found himself witnessing what appeared to be a complete breakdown of diplomatic protocol. Sir Edmund was a veteran of decades of royal service, a man who had navigated countless political crises and constitutional challenges with the discretion and wisdom that his position demanded. He took in the scene with a single glance, immediately understanding both what was happening and how disastrous it was for everyone involved. "Prime Minister," Sir Edmund said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who spoke for the crown itself, "perhaps we might continue this discussion in a more private setting." The intervention was tactfully worded but unmistakably firm. Sir Edmund was offering Hartwell a face-saving exit from a situation that had already caused irreparable damage to his political standing, but Hartwell was too far gone to recognize the lifeline being thrown to him. His confrontation with Morrison had become personal, and he was determined to prove his point regardless of the cost. "Sir Edmund," the Prime Minister replied, his voice still tight with frustration, "I am attempting to address a serious breach of protocol by Captain Morrison, who seems confused about the proper relationship between civilian and military authority." Sir Edmund's expression remained diplomatically neutral, but his eyes revealed his assessment of the situation. As someone who had observed British politics for decades, he could recognize a career-ending mistake when he saw one unfolding in real time. "Prime Minister," Sir Edmund said carefully, "the Royal Guard operates under very specific constitutional arrangements that have been established over centuries. Perhaps it would be helpful to review those arrangements in a more suitable environment." The private secretary was offering Hartwell one last chance to retreat gracefully, but the damage had already been done. The confrontation was being broadcast live across multiple platforms, and political commentators were already beginning to analyze the implications of a prime minister who apparently didn't understand the basic structure of British military authority. Captain Morrison remained at attention throughout the exchange, but his assessment of the situation was clear in his steady gaze. He had successfully defended his authority and that of his men, but he took no pleasure in the Prime Minister's public humiliation. Professional soldiers understood that political stability was important for the country they served. The morning sun continued its climb toward noon, casting shorter shadows across a courtyard that had become the stage for one of the most spectacular political failures in modern British history. The arrival of Sir Edmund Blackwood should have provided Prime Minister Hartwell with a diplomatic escape route, but his wounded pride and political desperation drove him to make what would prove to be his final, catastrophic mistake. Instead of accepting the graceful exit being offered, he decided to double down on his confrontation with Captain Morrison. "Sir Edmund," Hartwell declared, his voice carrying across the courtyard with reckless determination, "I'm glad you're here to witness this. Captain Morrison has refused direct orders from the head of government, and I want this incident documented for appropriate action." Sir Edmund's diplomatic composure flickered momentarily as he realized the full extent of the Prime Minister's misunderstanding. As someone who had spent his career managing the delicate balance between royal prerogative and political authority, he understood immediately that Hartwell had ventured into constitutional territory where he had no business operating. "Prime Minister," Sir Edmund said, his tone becoming more formal, "the Royal Guard operates under the direct authority of the Crown, not the government. Captain Morrison has acted entirely within his proper authority in maintaining protocol. The private secretary's words carried the weight of centuries of constitutional law and tradition. He was not offering an opinion but stating established fact, and his authority on such matters was unquestionable. But Hartwell was beyond the point where facts could penetrate his determination to prove his dominance. Sir Edmund, with respect, the constitutional relationship between government and military is more complex than traditional ceremony might suggest. I have legal authority that supersedes ceremonial protocol." This statement revealed the fundamental flaw in Hartwell's understanding. He viewed the Royal Guard as ceremonial decoration, rather than recognizing their genuine military status and constitutional role. His dismissal of ceremonial protocol demonstrated that he had completely missed the point of their function and authority. Captain Morrison had remained silent during the exchange between the two senior officials, but his professional assessment of the situation was clear. The Prime Minister was not just wrong about military law, he was wrong in a way that suggested dangerous ignorance about basic constitutional principles. The crowd of tourists had continued to grow, and the courtyard was now filled with dozens of people, recording every word of the confrontation. Social media notifications were pinging constantly as the hashtags continued to trend, and news organizations were beginning to pick up the story from the live streams. Sir Edmund made one final attempt to salvage the situation. "Prime Minister, perhaps we might discuss this matter privately with appropriate legal advisors present. The courtyard of Buckingham Palace may not be the ideal venue for resolving questions of constitutional authority." The suggestion was diplomatically phrased but carried an unmistakable urgency. Sir Edmund could see the political disaster unfolding and was trying desperately to contain the damage before it became irreversible. Hartwell's response sealed his fate. "No, Sir Edmund. This matter needs to be resolved here and now. I will not allow military personnel to refuse legitimate government orders, regardless of where the confrontation takes place." The Prime Minister had just rejected the final lifeline thrown to him by one of the most experienced diplomatic professionals in the British system. His insistence on continuing the public confrontation guaranteed that his humiliation would be complete and his political career effectively ended. Captain Morrison finally spoke again, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone delivering a final judgment. "Sir, I have explained the legal and constitutional framework governing my authority multiple times. Your continued insistence on orders that exceed your jurisdiction puts me in the position of having to formally document this incident for review by proper military authorities." The captain's words were delivered with the precision of a military report, but their implications were devastating for the Prime Minister. Morrison was essentially announcing that he would be filing an official complaint about Hartwell's conduct, creating a permanent record of this embarrassing confrontation. The tourist had fallen completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something historically significant. The live streams had attracted thousands of viewers worldwide, and political commentators were already beginning to analyze the constitutional implications of what they were seeing. Hartwell's press secretary had abandoned her position across the courtyard and was now approaching the group, her face pale with the realization that no amount of media management could salvage this situation. The footage being captured would be impossible to suppress or spin, and the Prime Minister's reputation was being destroyed in real time. "Captain Morrison," Hartwell said, his voice now shaking with barely controlled fury, "you are making a grave mistake. I have the power to end your career, transfer you to the most remote posting available, and ensure that your insubordination follows you for the rest of your military service." The threat was delivered with genuine venom, but it only served to highlight Hartwell's complete misunderstanding of military politics. Morrison's record of distinguished service and his current position meant that any attempt at political Retaliation would be immediately recognized and challenged by military leadership. Sir Edmund stepped forward, his diplomatic patience finally exhausted. "Prime Minister, I must insist that this confrontation end immediately. You are creating a constitutional crisis that serves no one's interests." The private secretary's intervention carried the implicit authority of the Crown itself. When the Queen's representative declared that a constitutional crisis was developing, it was not a suggestion but a formal warning that carried significant weight. But Hartwell was beyond the reach of rational counsel. His political career was already destroyed, though he hadn't yet realized it, and his personal pride demanded that he continue fighting even when victory was impossible. "Sir Edmund, Captain Morrison and everyone else present," the Prime Minister announced, raising his voice to address the entire courtyard. "I want to make something perfectly clear. I am the elected head of government in this country, and I will not be dismissed or ignored by anyone, regardless of their traditional privileges or ceremonial roles." The declaration was meant to sound authoritative, but it came across as the desperate ranting of someone who had lost control of the situation. The tourists exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with witnessing such a public meltdown by a senior government official. Captain Morrison's response was delivered with the finality of a court verdict. "Sir, your elected status grants you significant authority over government policy and civilian administration. It does not grant you command authority over the Royal Guard, which operates under different constitutional arrangements that predate your office by centuries." The captain had just delivered a constitutional law lesson that would be quoted in textbooks for decades to come. His calm explanation of the limits of political authority versus military tradition was being broadcast live to audiences around the world. The sound of additional footsteps on cobblestone announced the arrival of more palace staff, drawn by reports of an unusual confrontation in the main courtyard. The growing audience of official witnesses made it impossible for anyone to later claim that the incident had been misunderstood or taken out of context. Prime Minister Hartwell looked around the courtyard, finally beginning to grasp the magnitude of his mistake. The cameras, the tourists, the palace officials, and the steadfast guards all represented different aspects of the humiliation he had brought upon himself through his arrogant overreach. The final moments of Prime Minister Hartwell's political career unfolded with the slow-motion inevitability of a building collapse. As he stood in the courtyard of Buckingham Palace, surrounded by tourists with cameras, palace officials, and the unmoving royal guards who had just delivered the most public rejection of his authority imaginable, the reality of his situation finally began to penetrate his wounded pride. The live streams had attracted hundreds of thousands of viewers worldwide, and Prime Minister Humiliated was trending across every major social media platform. Political commentators in television studios were already analyzing the constitutional implications of what they were calling the most spectacular political self-destruction in modern British history. Sir Edmund Blackwood stepped forward one final time, his diplomatic training compelling him to offer some semblance of dignity to the situation, even though the damage was irreversible. "Prime Minister," he said quietly, "I believe your scheduled meeting with Her Majesty has been moved to a more private location within the palace." It was a face-saving fiction. There had been no change to the meeting schedule, but Sir Edmund was providing Hartwell with a final opportunity to retreat from the courtyard before his humiliation became even more complete. For a moment, it seemed as though the Prime Minister might accept this last lifeline. His press secretary was making desperate gestures from the edge of the crowd, and the growing number of palace staff present made it clear that continuing the confrontation would only make things worse. But Hartwell's political instincts had been completely overwhelmed by personal pride and wounded ego. Instead of accepting the graceful exit, he made one final, devastating mistake, Captain Morrison, he declared, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard. "You have humiliated the office of Prime Minister and shown contempt for democratic authority. I want your name and rank for my official report, and I want you to know that this incident will follow you for the rest of your career." The threat was petty and vindictive, revealing the small-minded nature of a man who had been thoroughly outclassed by superior character and professional competence. Morrison's response would be remembered and quoted for generations. "Sir," the captain replied, his voice carrying the dignity that Hartwell had long since abandoned, I am Captain James Morrison, Distinguished Service Order of Her Majesty's Royal Guard. I have served my country with honor for 25 years, and I will continue to do so regardless of political pressure or personal threats. My duty is to the Crown and the people of Britain, not to any individual politician who mistakes temporary office for permanent authority. Morrison's words rang with the authority of absolute moral certainty. He had just delivered what amounted to a masterclass in leadership, demonstrating how a true public servant responds to inappropriate pressure from those who abuse their position. The tourists burst into spontaneous applause, their phones still recording as they witnessed something remarkable. Here was a soldier who understood duty and honor in a way that the elected leader of the country apparently did not. The applause was the final humiliation for Prime Minister Hartwell. Tourists, foreign visitors to his own country, were cheering for a soldier who had publicly rejected his authority. The symbolism was devastating and would be replayed on news programs around the world for weeks to come. Sir Edmund stepped forward once more, his voice carrying the firm authority of someone ending an embarrassing scene. "Prime Minister, I believe this matter has been sufficiently addressed. Your meeting awaits." This time, Hartwell had no choice but to comply. His political career was finished, his reputation destroyed, and his understanding of power revealed as fundamentally flawed. As he turned to walk toward the palace entrance, his press secretary fell into step beside him, already calculating how to minimize the damage from what could not be prevented. Captain Morrison and his guardsmen remained at their posts, their duty unchanged by the political drama that had just unfolded around them. They represented something eternal and unchanging in British life, something that transcended the temporary ambitions of individual politicians. Within hours, video footage of the confrontation was being broadcast on every major news network in the world. Political analysts dissected Hartwell's fundamental misunderstanding of constitutional law. Military historians explained the ancient traditions governing the Royal Guard, and constitutional scholars debated the broader implications of the incident. The hashtag #BeerCaptainMorrison began trending alongside criticism of the Prime Minister, as social media users praised the Guard officers' dignified defense of military tradition and proper protocol. Memes and commentary flooded the internet, with Morrison being hailed as a symbol of integrity and professional competence. Prime Minister Hartwell's approval ratings plummeted overnight. Within a week, members of his own party were calling for his resignation. Within a month, he had stepped down from office, his political career ended by a single morning's display of arrogance and ignorance in the courtyard of Buckingham Palace. Captain Morrison continued his service with the same quiet professionalism that had characterized his entire military career. He never spoke publicly about the incident, maintaining the discretion that was expected of someone in his position. But his actions that morning had demonstrated something important about the nature of true authority and the difference between power and respect. The Royal Guard continued their ancient duty, standing watch over the monarchy with the same unwavering dedication that had protected the crown for centuries. They served as a reminder that some institutions transcend politics, that some traditions carry more weight than temporary authority, and that genuine respect must be earned rather than demanded. The tourists eventually dispersed, but their footage and photographs ensured that the incident would be remembered forever. Prime Minister Hartwell had intended to demonstrate his authority over Britain's most famous soldiers. Instead, he had provided the world with a perfect example of what happens when arrogance meets integrity, when political ambition confronts military honor, and when someone confuses the appearance of power with its reality.